On behalf of all of us associated with Brigham Young University, I want to welcome Professor Ahmed and his colleagues to our campus. We're delighted they have been able to visit us as part of their Journey into America tour that began last September. According to the BBC, Professor Akbar Ahmed is probably the world's best-known scholar on contemporary Islam. A native of Pakistan, he's the former High Commissioner of Pakistan to Great Britain. Currently is the Ibn Khaldun Chair of Islamic Studies and Professor of International Relations at American University in Washington, D.C. He's a distinguished anthropologist, a writer, a filmmaker, has been actively involved in interfaith discussions in the study of global Islam and its impact on contemporary society for many years. Educated in Great Britain, he took his BA degree from Birmingham University, his MA from Cambridge, and his PhD from the University of London. He has a long and distinguished civil service career while holding visiting professor positions at Harvard University, Cambridge, and the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. Earlier this year, as I mentioned, he announced he was taking a one-year sabbatical to research Muslims in America and the attitudes and perceptions of Americans regarding their Muslim neighbors. Patterned after his earlier tour throughout the Muslim world that he and his colleagues made while they wrote their latest book called Journey into Islam, The Crisis of Globalization, their tour in America will take them to over 30 American towns and cities. We welcome the opportunity of Professor Ahmed speaking with us today. We look forward to his remarks. We've had an opportunity to spend some time with him this afternoon. He's a good man who's struggling to build bridges of understanding and goodwill among good people everywhere. It's our pleasure to have him with us. Professor Ahmed.
Thank you for that very warm introduction. Thank you for that prayer. Any speaker needs any amount of prayer that he or she can get, so thank you for the prayer. I would like to thank all of you at this short notice to have gathered. I want to thank our host, Dr. Peterson, for Elder Banks and Susan for driving us here. I am here with my team, Frankie and Haley, and Susan, the mother of Haley, and we are grateful, Susan, you joined us. It's wonderful to be at this university. Perhaps you don't realize, but this is a world-renowned educational center. And it's more than met my expectations. I've come here, I've met some very impressive faculty, seen some very impressive students, and I'm seeing how impressively you're filling in the questionnaire, so continue filling them in while you talk, while you listen to me, and we'll have a question-answer session. And I discovered that you are producing here some great translations of some of the great classic Arabic texts. Now, this is seminal work. Perhaps you don't realize how important this work is, but this work will have a major impact on the globe once it is revealed in its full form. And when I talk of revealed, I come towards this great religion, this religion within which so many members of this university live, that is the Mormon Church. And for me as a Muslim, my first experience was at Palmyra when we went, how many weeks ago, Haley? 2 or 3 weeks ago. And we met President Clark and members of the church there. They welcomed us in the church. And what I noticed was that they were particularly welcoming to the Muslims in our team. They were welcoming to the whole team, but particularly the Muslims. And that intrigued me. And that helped me to begin to understand the church in relationship to society, to the struggle, to faith, to piety, persecution, and yet commitment to a certain way of life. And that, in a sense, reflects the Muslim community and the experience of the Muslim community today. My own experience has been over the last few years, particularly since 9/11, to continuously try to reach out in understanding, in bridge building, and creating a space within which people can begin to talk to each other, simply to talk. Because Islam, in some senses, just like the church we are discussing, has become something of a mystery. It is, to use Churchill's famous phrase, a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Susan, I hope I've got it right. She's the learned one in the team. And I only say this when she's here, because otherwise Haley is the learned one, her daughter. Sorry, Haley, the title's been shifted to your mum. So Islam is like that. Everyone has some notion of it. With the Mormon Church, it's something similar. The media has one idea. The critics have another idea. And we have been privileged today to speak to some very distinguished members of the church and to be informed and to be enlightened. I think it's exemplary in the way that young men and women are being taught to live by a certain code, to live up to certain ideals. It is a world, for all of you, the young, the future leaders of America, a world where you'll face many challenges. And one of the challenges is that there are so many choices. A world where you have a bewildering set of choices. And that can easily challenge you. Everything is available. Everything is acceptable. Everything is okay. So where do you end up in the end? And that's why you have to hang on to something. And what you're hanging on to is a set of behavior patterns, of moral values, of standards. And these are things that you must really cherish and value, because they help you find a path through a very complicated world. A world which will be even more challenging for you, because you're not only part of a church which is sometimes misunderstood, but also part of a nation which at this moment is going through a crisis internationally. A nation that's sometimes not particularly popular abroad. You face a whole set of challenges. A time when America needs to be giving a clear leadership to the rest of the world. And some of that leadership really comes from a moral understanding of the world. Moral leadership. A clear moral leadership, which in some senses is the finest vision that America has of itself, going back to the founding fathers. And it was in this spirit that I decided to take a sabbatical and proceed on a journey through the United States to understand pluralism, tolerance, acceptance, democracy, civil rights through the prism of the Muslim community. And while looking at the Muslim community, I came upon the Mormon community. And therefore this has helped me to understand the nature of a minority struggling to maintain its own identity. And I was very privileged to be joined by my team, the team that had journeyed with me earlier to the Muslim world. We had traveled to the Middle East, to South Asia, to Far East Asia. We met presidents, prime ministers, students, professors, imams. We went to madrasas, the most orthodox madrasas in the Muslim world. And from that journey came a book called Journey into Islam. And we are hoping from this particular journey through the United States will also come a book. And we also have a blog. I'd request you to join us. Go to the blog, look up Journey into America, one word, .wordpress.com. And you'll see the writings of my team, scintillating stuff, amusing stuff. I'm not overdoing it, am I, Frankie? He's saying, go on. And film footage. So while we are talking, interviewing people, you'll also see film footage and some really interesting stuff. For example, the interview with Chomsky, Professor Chomsky at MIT, or footage from a mosque, or talking to a rabbi or a bishop or an interesting person we meet on the journey. And it'll help you as young Americans to relate to some of the issues that we are looking at. Our primary interest is to see how a great nation like America sees its own identity, defines itself at a critical moment in its history. And you're seeing how critical this moment is in the elections, when for the first time we've just elected an African American as president, the next president of the United States. So there are huge fundamental changes taking place and huge expectations. But the challenges will not go away. So the challenges you're going to be facing once you leave university in the next decade or 2 decades, those challenges will not go away. You will have challenges which will be there, which will face you. Political challenges. The challenges of living in a consumerist world, a materialist world, a world that encourages selfishness and encourages you to just be me and think about yourself, when in fact you are part of a larger community. And these are challenges which will be aided and helped if you have a strong moral mooring. And this is the great advantage of a university like the one you are at, this great university. So with that, with these opening remarks, I'll be delighted to talk to you. If you have any questions, please put up your hand and I'd be happy to talk and hear your comments or your questions. Who is the first brave one? Yes, and could you stand up and give us your name so that we know who you are?
My name is Nephi Henry. Early on, you brought up the concept of persecution. I think that that's built itself into the Mormon identity quite strongly, quite firmly. I don't know how it's built itself into the Muslim identity. I thought I'd ask that. Also, I've seen, I believe that it's been, in some ways, detrimental to the Mormon mindset to think so much of how we've been persecuted, or to dwell on that maybe as much as we do. Not denying the faith and the diligence of those who've gone before us. But if it is detrimental, how do we get over that mentality and live our lives as today?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking. Now, are you a Mormon yourself?
I am.
Well, I think the question addressed to the Mormon Church, we have so many distinguished elders here. I'm sure that they'll be able to talk to you later on. I'm not sure whether Dr. Peterson is going to say, give me 6 push-ups or 10 push-ups or whatever they for asking difficult questions. But it is a very important question. If you carry the sense of persecution too far, then you end up with an asymmetry in terms of the balances that you must have to live a successful life. I don't necessarily mean it in terms of psychology. I mean it in terms of sociology, which means how the majority perceives another community. And just the fact in sheer numbers that the Mormon community is a minority means that it is looked as a minority. And if you look at the press, they will not pick up the strong points which have impressed or so impressed us meeting and talking to members of the church. They will pick up what is distorted, what is caricature. And they'll just harp on that thing. That's the nature of the press, nothing to do with Mormons or Muslims. Muslims are in a similar position in the sense that after 9/11, particularly in the United States, Muslim situation is slightly different because there are about 6-7 million Muslims living in the United States, but there are also over 1 billion Muslims living over there in Africa and Asia. And there, they're confident, they have their own traditions intact, and they're not particularly bothered about ideas of being a persecuted minority. They may be angered at the notion that we are misunderstood, people distort our religion, people attack our prophet, people attack our God, people attack our customs. Sound familiar? They may be angry about that, but then don't feel persecuted because they can fight back. Sometimes they fight back through books, through articles, through scholarship. Sometimes they do silly things and stupid things and violent things, which we don't support. In your case, it's very different. In your case, you are American. You are living here. You are part of this landscape. This is very much, in that sense, an American religion. And you're able to shape this nation, contribute to this nation. In a sense, the identities overlap. I think Dr. Peterson gave a beautiful definition of being a Mormon and being an American. So keep this in mind that when you're looking at the Muslims, and we're just talking concepts because we are on campus, we are scholars looking at concepts. We can only take a comparison that far and not much further. The Muslim community in the United States after 9/11 does feel very much persecuted. It feels persecuted in terms of being ridiculed, its prophet being attacked, being called a terrorist, its God being humiliated and mocked, its customs. This is the Muslim community as a whole. It doesn't matter whether you are a good citizen, bad citizen, a citizen or not a citizen. You may just be picked up and you have very little rights. So in that sense, there is in the Muslim community today a sense of unease. A lot of Muslims are actively involved in interfaith dialogue, in reaching out and trying to calm things down. But on the other hand, you have the media, and the media is constantly pumping an idea of Islam. And as there are not many Muslim people in the media, in the newspapers, writing columns, you don't see too many Muslim faces in the national news, a lot of people are genuinely puzzled by Muslims, and therefore this notion of being a mystery, being a riddle. And some of the stories that we are finding on our journey are quite heartbreaking. They really are. Again, it is directly related to a persecution complex. Maybe it's imaginary. A lot of the time, minorities begin to imagine persecution. You don't do well in class, you say, well, I'm a member of the minority community. You don't get a part in a play, well, I'm a member of the minority community. We begin to use it as a crutch, so I completely agree with you that we shouldn't be using anything as a crutch, but at the same time, as scholars, we need to be as clear sociologically as possible. Let me recount a story for you of visiting a mosque in New York, in Brooklyn, in what was once called Little Pakistan. And Haley, you were with us that day. Just recount how you responded to the little boy, the 10-year-old boy, and that 10-year-old boy sums it up for you, the sense of persecution. Please, Haley. Why don't you use this? Is this thing on? Is it working? Why did you come here?
Well, we were in New York, Brooklyn, as Dr. Ahmed was saying, and we sat down with a group of Muslims there. It was a Shia mosque. And we were talking to the little boys and their fathers that were there. And this little boy was saying that he had grown up, he had been born in the United States, he'd grown up there, and he was saying that every day he goes to school, he's beat up and called a terrorist. And as a little boy, you know, that's really hard. And he was saying that he hates it and he doesn't belong anywhere. And his father actually came up and told Dr. Ahmed's wife in Urdu, because he didn't speak English, that this little boy's father had been blown up in Pakistan by terrorists. And so the irony was that he was suffering every day in this nation that's supposed to have religious pluralism and tolerance and openness, and that's such a wonderful country, and his own mother had been taken away from him, and it completely broke my heart. It made me so sad.
So again, thank you, Haley, for telling us that story, because Haley was really moved. Here was this 10-year-old boy, all he had known was persecution, simply because he happened to be a Muslim. And he was beaten up in class every day. And his mother had been blown up by terrorists in Pakistan. So he was being squeezed between two kinds of prejudices, two kinds of violence. And that's the predicament of the minority. So the minority does need people to speak up for it and to explain things and to somehow tackle the media, the stereotypes, the caricatures in the media. Because unless that happens, the reality is one thing and the media perception another thing. And then we have a problem. And I believe that Muslims certainly do have a problem in the media. There have been many, many efforts by some wonderful people, inspiring people to create bridges, but the misunderstandings remain very high in the media. And the result is that the Pew report, published a couple of months ago, confirmed that the gap between America and the Muslim world has actually grown, the understanding between the two. So most Americans see Muslims, here's perception again, as violent, threatening, extremist, fundamentalist. And Muslims see Americans exactly the same, violent, threatening, fundamentalist, and also immoral and behaving in the most lewd manner, etc., and not very Christian in their behavior. So you can see this gap increasing, and you can see the necessity for some kind of vigorous understanding. And that is partly what we are about. This is what we are trying to do. A small band, but we've set off with a lot of faith in our hearts and optimism in our hearts. Hope and change, the two big words. and we hope we'll succeed. So you have a question over there.
Yes, my name is Jonathan Stoddard. I'm a MESA major, Middle Eastern Studies. And I was just wondering, as someone who's lived in both Europe and America, what difference you see between the treatment of the Muslim minority or the life of Muslims in the two different areas?
Excellent question. I must say, Dr. Peterson, I congratulate you on your students. Very high standard. They haven't been tutored, I know, because they got such short notice. The difference between Muslims living in the UK, Europe, France, Germany, Italy, and here in the United States is huge. First of all, understand how they came about to become citizens or immigrants to these lands. In Europe, the relationship is based on the colonial experience. So for the last 200 years, the last 2-3 centuries, France colonized most of North Africa. So the immigrants to France are mainly North African. They are from Algeria or from Libya or from Morocco. In Spain, they're mainly from Morocco. In England, because England colonized the South Asian subcontinent, they're mostly from what is now Pakistan, India or Bangladesh. So the relationship goes back to the colonial encounter. And the colonial encounter is a very complex one. There's great familiarity with the Muslim world. So there's understanding, there's respect, there's knowledge. There's some great books written out of this encounter, some great literature. At the same time, there is a kind of hierarchy here. There is a colonizer and a colonized. There's a master and there's the native. And it's not an equal relationship. Or it wasn't till these people became citizens. And some of that prejudice remains. And you see some of it in the literature even today, and the complaints of the minorities. In America, it's completely different. Muslims arriving here, first, of course, they came as part of the great waves of slaves brought from Africa. So they didn't come here in a voluntary capacity. They came here, and they were suddenly disrupted, uprooted from their native environment and brought to America. But a lot of them were Muslim. 30 to 40% is estimated were Muslims in the African American community. And over time, they lost their identity. Nonetheless, they are now part of the American fabric. And here you have a president now whose father was Muslim, Obama's. The next wave is the Middle East, the Arabs, Turks, Persians, including the Arabs. And they come around the Second World War. Some families come even earlier, maybe 2 generations earlier. But the large bulk come Second World War and after. And then towards the end of the century, you have the waves coming from South Asia. So 3 quite distinct waves of immigrants coming. And they're coming here to become American. They're coming here to be part of the American dream. And we met many Muslims on this journey who are part of the American dream, who are surviving, thriving, flourishing as Americans. They're also Pakistanis, also Bangladeshis. That prejudice, that edge, that hierarchy that they may have seen in England and France doesn't really exist in the United States for them. America is genuinely an open, pluralistic society. At its best, there is no society in the world like the United States of America. There really isn't, either in concept or in practice. And again, we talk of persecution. There have been persecuted minorities, there's been conflict, there's civil war, there's slavery. But when you compare this society with any other society in the world, this is a unique society. So they were coming to this particular dream of an ideal society. Then 9/11 happens. And with 9/11, things change for the Muslims. And that's where stereotyping and caricature and the media perception of Islam comes into play. And after 9/11, Muslims in the USA or even in Europe would have a tough time, a difficult time, in varying degrees, but a difficult time. So there is a historical background when we compare the two. Also, another fact to remember is that many Muslims coming to the United States came in the middle class. They were professionals, they were doctors, engineers, lawyers, so they were coming with education. And they sort of came straight in to the middle class. So they jumped this whole process of starting as homesteaders or working in factories or labor. They just came straight into a profession. Very quickly they were part of the American dream. In Europe, that first generation came as factory workers. Their children may have got some education, maybe slightly better off economically, but they still had to gain social acceptance. Very different routes, different trajectories, and different destinies for the two groups of Muslim migrants. Yeah. How are the questionnaires doing? I hope you're all about to complete them, because Elder Banks is looking at his watch. He's going to drive us back.
My name's Oliver Anderson, and I was curious, with some of what was spoken earlier with prejudice and whatnot, people feeding on that, maybe that becomes more of their identity, and it can have negative effects. It seems like a lot of Muslim people are not affected with that. You know, there's some people with ethnicity where their parents were hard workers, and then they grow up in a society where there's a lot of prejudice, and they don't make a lot of their life, or they fall into a cycle where it's hard to get ahead. It seems even though today there's a lot of prejudice against Muslims, they're still able to do a lot, to be educated, to be proficient with business. And is there something in the Islamic faith that you believe encourages that?
Thank you, Oliver. That's a great question. Islam very much encourages Muslims to live in this world. It encourages a balance. The balance is between, and you've got several scholars of Islam here, between deen and dunya. Deen is religion, and dunya is this world. So a good Muslim must balance the two. Of course, some Muslims, we were discussing this with the faculty a few hours ago, some Muslims want to give up the world. They've had enough of it. They become mystics, Sufis. They want to withdraw to the caves and the mountains. They believe this world is an illusion. But the mainstream Muslim does balance deen and dunya. So there's no discouragement for engaging and living in the real world. And many, many Muslims have done extremely well. There's an interesting trend now. We already have 2 Muslim members as congressmen, Keith Ellison and Carson, African Americans. So already you're seeing much more active Muslim participation in the political process. And for Mormons, the interesting thing I discovered today was that Mormons in the 19th century were seen as the Muslims of America. So now I don't know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing to announce, but that's how they were seen in the 19th century. So ponder on that one and ask Dr. Peterson what it means.
We have about 5 more minutes. One more question.
I shall respect what Elder Banks is saying, that we have 5 more minutes. So how many questions, Elder Banks? One more question, yes. What about a lady? We haven't had a female question yet. Is there anyone? Oh, here we are. Good. Come along. Well done.
My name is Sarah Petty. I was just wondering, do you think that the gap between the different factions in Islam, like between Sunnis and Shiites, do you think as the world's becoming more globalized and as modern times keep going, do you think the gap is closing or widening?
Sarah, again, that's a very interesting sociological question. The world is coming together and unifying. You're absolutely right. But at the same time, simultaneously, there's a contradictory movement taking place, which is the world is also splitting. So you're also rediscovering ethnicity and tribe and sect. It's happening everywhere. So while people are coming together, they're also splitting up. You're recreating your own identities. It's a very interesting part of world history. The Shia-Sunni divide is deep. And it's not so much theological, it's much more political. Think about it. Where is the Shia world? It's basically Iran. And many Shias in Iraq, but Iran is the epicenter. And it's the conflict between imperial Iran, which becomes Muslim in the 7th century, and the Arabs, which begins to define the Shia-Sunni struggle. And that's a struggle that goes right up into our times. The Arabs versus the Persians, the Iranians. So one is Shia, one is Sunni. So it's more complex than just Shia-Sunni, and that will remain. We in South Asia get caught up because we are neither Arab nor Persian. So there are a lot of Shia living in our part of the world, something like 30%. And there's also conflict there, because some line up with one, some line up with the other. So I suspect, like the schisms and the divisions and the different sects and denominations in the Christian tradition, you will have this continuing, and sometimes they'll be more civilized, sometimes they'll be killing each other, and sometimes, hopefully, they'll be talking to each other and having dialogue and understanding. That's up to you, Sarah, and your generation. So push dialogue and bridge building and create friendships.